High above the half-finished spires of a grand cathedral, a falcon circles, its wings catching the golden light of dawn. Below, the shouts of masons and the clang of chisels rise like music from the stone. This isn't just a scene from medieval life, it's the moment two worlds collide, where the sky meets the earth, and where two families, one masters of the falconer's art, the other architects of stone and faith, begin a partnership that would echo through centuries. What could a falconer and a stonemason possibly have in common? More than you'd think. Their story isn't just about skill or trade. It's about how seemingly opposite forces can unite to create something extraordinary, something that outlives them both. Picture this, a time when cathedrals reached for the heavens, not just as buildings, but as testaments to human ambition. Now imagine the falcon, a symbol of freedom and precision, soaring above those very towers. The falconers, with their keen understanding of wind and flight, and the architects, with their mastery of balance and form, shared something deeper than their crafts. They shared a vision, a belief that their work could transcend the ordinary, that their collaboration could leave a mark on history. But how did these families, so different in their daily lives, come to rely on each other? How did their bond become the stuff of legend? That's the story we're uncovering today, a tale of how the falconer's daughter and the architect's son defied the boundaries of their time, blending their family's wisdom to achieve the impossible. From the secrets of training birds to the delicate art of vaulted ceilings, their legacy is a reminder that greatness often comes from unexpected alliances. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk the cobbled streets of their world, uncover the innovations they sparked, and discover the lessons their partnership holds for us today. Because this isn't just a story about the past, it's about what happens when we dare to bridge divides, when we look beyond what separates us to what unites us. Ready to step into their world, let's begin. The falconer's daughter grew up with the wind in her hair and the cry of hawks in her ears. Her childhood playground, the open skies and rolling hills where her father's birds hunted. From the moment she could walk, she learned the language of wings, the way a goshawk tilts its head before striking, how a peregrine folds its body into a dive, the quiet patience required to earn a bird's trust. Training a raptor wasn't just a skill, it was a dance of respect. A single misstep, a raised voice, a sudden movement could undo months of work, but she had a gift. By the age of 10, she could call a merlin to her glove with nothing but a whistle. By 12, she could mend a falcon's broken feather with hands steadier than most surgeons. Her first hunt was the stuff of family legend. A snowstorm had grounded the king's falconers, their prized birds huddled against the cold. But the falconer's daughter, barely 14, stepped forward with a gyrfalcon her father had entrusted to her, a bird so fierce it would snap at seasoned handlers. Yet when she raised her arm, the falcon launched without hesitation, a streak of white against the gray sky. Minutes later, it returned with a hare, dropping the prize at her feet as the court erupted in cheers. That day, the whispers began. She wasn't just skilled, she was touched by something rare, an almost mystical kinship with the birds. Her family's reputation spread beyond their village, drawing nobles and even kings to seek their expertise. Falcons trained by their hand never missed a kill. Their methods were studied, their secrets coveted. But for the falconer's daughter, the birds were more than status symbols, they were partners. She knew their moods, their quirks, the way a kestrel would preen after a successful hunt or a sparrowhawk would fuss if its perch was moved. That deep understanding set her apart, and it was that same insight that would one day catch the eye of a young man more accustomed to sketching archers than studying flight. The architect's son had spent his life among scaffolds and blueprints, his world one of angles and calculations. Yet when he first saw her standing at the edge of a cliff, a falcon soaring obediently back to her wrist, he didn't see a curiosity, he saw a kindred spirit. Both of them were builders in their own way, she shaping trust between creature and human, he shaping stone into monuments. And when their paths finally crossed in the shadow of that half-finished cathedral, it wasn't just two people meeting, it was two worlds colliding, each with something the other lacked. The Falconer's daughter knew the sky, the architect's son knew how to reach it. Together, they'd build something no one had ever seen before. The architect's son knew the weight of stone before he could even lift it, his earliest memories laced with the rhythmic tap of mallets and the scent of limestone dust. While other children played with wooden swords, he traced the lines of his father's blueprints with ink-stained fingers, learning to read the language of curves and load-bearing walls as effortlessly as others read poetry. By 10, he could name every arch in the nearby abbey. By 12, he'd corrected a visiting master mason on the angle of a flying buttress, his quiet confidence leaving the man speechless. His playground wasn't fields or forests, but construction sites, spaces where earth met ambition, where scaffolding reached like skeletal fingers toward the divine. His first solo project, a chapel no larger than a peasant's hut, became local legend. Built when he was just 15, it shouldn't have stood. The proportions defied tradition, windows taller than the walls, a vaulted ceiling that seemed to float without support. The older mason scoffed, calling it a child's folly. But when the first winter storm passed without so much as a cracked keystone, the whispers began. The boy didn't just build, he listened to the stone as if the rock itself whispered back where to carve. His family's workshop buzzed with the era's greatest minds, mathematicians debating the golden ratio, glassmakers experimenting with cobalt pigments, blacksmiths forging tools that could slice marble like butter. Yet the architect's son was drawn to the spaces between the lines, the unsolved riddles of medieval engineering. How could light be harnessed to paint saints' faces across a nave? Could a tower climb higher without collapsing under its own weight? While others copied the past, he sketched the future, spiraling staircases that defied gravity, facades where every sculpture told a story. Then came the day he climbed the cathedral's unfinished spire and saw her, the Falconer's daughter, standing on the cliffs beyond the city, her arm outstretched as a peregrine sliced through the clouds. He'd watched birds before, of course, but only as obstacles, their nests clogging gargoyle mouths. Now, seeing the way the falcon banked on unseen currents, how it adjusted its wings mid-dive to strike with pinpoint accuracy, something clicked. The same principles that guided a bird's flight could shape a vault's curve. The same intuition that trained a hawk to trust human hands might just solve the cathedral's greatest weakness, a bell tower that swayed like a sapling in the wind. Their meeting wasn't fate, it was physics. The architect's son needed to understand the sky. The falconer's daughter held its secrets. And when he hesitantly approached her with a sketch of a spire inspired by a falcon's folded wings, she didn't laugh. She pointed to the paper and said, "The tail feathers, you've missed how they fan to break." In that moment, two families became collaborators, their crafts weaving together like the ribs of a Gothic vault. The stonemasons would call it madness, the falconers would call it magic, but history would call it a masterpiece. The royal festival was meant to celebrate the cathedral's progress, but no one expected the sky itself to join the ceremony. As nobles gathered below, their silks shimmering in the afternoon light, the falconer's daughter stood apart, her gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on the half-finished spire stretching precariously toward the clouds. She'd brought her newest charge, a young peregrine still learning its strength, and as the bird tensed on her glove, she felt its restlessness mirror her own. Below them, the architect's son paced the scaffolding, his fingers brushing the spire's rough edges like a musician tuning an instrument. He'd spent weeks agonizing over its angle, certain the design could soar higher if only he could find the right balance between ambition and gravity. Then the falcon leapt. Witnesses would later swear the bird moved with purpose, not hunting, not fleeing, but drawn to the spire as if answering an unspoken call. It circled once, twice, then alighted on the very tip of the unfinished stone, its talons gripping the edge with effortless precision. A hush fell over the crowd. Falcons didn't perch on construction sites. They avoided the noise, the dust, the unnatural shapes. Yet there it stood, a living ornament atop the architect's dream, as if claiming it for the sky. The architect's son froze, his breath catching. He'd studied doves nesting in eaves, watched swallows dart through arches, but this was different. The falcon wasn't just resting, it was balancing, adjusting its wings with minute shifts that counteracted the wind's pull. In that instant, he saw the solution to his spire's instability, not thicker walls, but a design that moved like a bird in flight. Below, the falconer's daughter didn't call her bird back. She watched, transfixed, as the architect's son slowly raised a hand, not to shoo the creature away, but to sketch its posture in the air. Their eyes met across the dizzying space between earth and sky, and something silent passed between them. A monk's chronicle from that year records it as a miracle. The falcon crowned the spire, and two souls, though strangers, spoke without words. What followed wasn't just collaboration, it was alchemy. The falconer's daughter began visiting the construction site daily, her birds demonstrating how weight distributed in midair, how feathers fanned to stabilize a dive. The architect's son, in turn, taught her to read blueprints, showing how a vault's curve could mimic a wing's arch. Their families, initially skeptical, soon found their crafts intertwined. Falconry ropes, woven from the same tough fibers used to lift stone blocks, became the talk of the Masons' Guild. The architect's father, a pragmatic man, marveled at how the falconer's understanding of wind currents informed the placement of buttresses. "We've been building against nature," he admitted. "They've shown us how to build with it." By the time the spire was completed, its silhouette now echoing the taper of a falcon's wing. The two families had forged something rarer than stone or feather, a shared language. When the falconer's daughter pointed out how her gyrfalcon's tail feathers dampened turbulence during landings, the architects adapted the pattern into the cathedral's gargoyles, their angled spouts dispersing rainwater with newfound efficiency. When the architect's son noted how layered stone could channel sound like a bird's syrinx, the falconers redesigned their hunting calls to carry farther across the fields. What began as a chance encounter became a blueprint for innovation, proving that the most enduring structures aren't just built by hands, but by the unexpected alliances between them. The cathedral's ribbed vaults didn't just arch, they soared. When the architect's son first sketched their design, his charcoal strokes mirrored the falconer's daughter's descriptions of wings in flight, the way a bird's primary feathers splayed for lift, how secondary feathers overlapped for strength. What began as parchment doodles became stone poetry, a ceiling that didn't merely cover the nave but seemed to breathe with it. Visitors would later swear the vaults shimmered like a falcon's underside catching sunlight, their delicate ribs fanning outward like the barbs of a feather. Even the medieval scholar Theophilus praised it as a marriage of earth and air, where stone learned the grace of the hunted. But the real marvel lay in the details unseen. The falconer's daughter had noticed how her birds adjusted their talons mid-flight to compensate for wind shear, a subtle shift in weight that kept them steady. The architect's son translated this into the cathedral's flying buttresses, angling their supports not rigidly, but in graduated tiers that absorbed pressure like a raptor's flexing claws. Where older churches groaned under their own weight, this one stood silent, its balance so precise that a single mason could topple a misplaced block with a fingertip. "It's not about fighting the wind," the Falconer's Daughter told the guild, "but letting it pass through you just as a falcon does." Their innovations rippled beyond the cathedral. In the nearby abbey's cloister, columns twisted like the spiraling dive of a kestrel, their fluted edges channeling rainwater away as efficiently as a bird's oiled plumage. The architect's son even redesigned the stonemason scaffolds after watching falconers use pivoting perches to train young birds, replacing static platforms with rotating brackets that let workers adjust their positions mid-air. "Why should men be less nimble than hawks?" he quipped, earning both laughter and grudging admiration from the guild. Medieval chronicles brim with accounts of their collaboration's impact. Brother Eadmer of Canterbury wrote of a chapel where stained glass windows were arranged like the layered feathers of a falcon's wing, their colors shifting with the sun to cast a living tapestry of light. A traveling merchant from Ghent marveled at a bridge whose arches, inspired by the Falconer's Daughter's notes on migratory patterns, withstood floods that toppled heavier constructions. The river raged like the devil himself, yet the bridge danced with it, bending as a reed does before rising again. What made their partnership extraordinary wasn't just the blending of crafts, but the reshaping of an era's aesthetic. Suddenly, towers weren't just tall, they were alive, their spires tapering like a falcon's beak, their finials curling like the quills of a molting wing. Even the gargoyles, once grimacing and static, took on the fluid menace of birds of prey, their jaws gaping not as monsters but as hunters mid-strike. The Falconer's Daughter had given the architect something revolutionary: permission to see the natural world not as something to conquer, but as the ultimate teacher. And in doing so, they transformed the skyline of medieval Europe from a testament of human dominance into a dialogue with the wind itself. The construction site roared with the clamor of hammers and chisels, a cacophony so deafening that shouted orders dissolved into the din. Yet amid the chaos, the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son moved with uncanny precision, their communication silent, their understanding deeper than words. They had borrowed from the ancient language of Falconry, where a raised glove or a flicked wrist could command a bird mid-flight, and adapted it to the dizzying heights of the cathedral. A palm tilted downward meant slow the pulley. A fist tapped against the chest signaled steady the beam. 2 fingers brushed upward, adjust the angle. What began as a practical solution soon became their secret dialect, a way to cut through noise and distance with the elegance of a falcon's dive. The day the scaffolding nearly collapsed tested their system to its limits. High above the nave, a team of masons had misaligned a keystone, their ropes straining under the uneven weight. The architect's son, spotting the danger from across the site, didn't waste breath yelling. Instead, he caught the Falconer's Daughter's eye and swept his arm in a wide arc, the same gesture she used to recall a bird from a long hunt. She understood instantly. Within moments, she'd redirected a team of laborers to brace the supports, while he scaled the wooden framework to redistribute the load. By the time the foreman realized what was happening, the crisis had been averted, the stones settling into place with a whisper rather than a crash. Their silent language did more than prevent disasters. It rewrote the rules of medieval construction. Without the delay of shouted commands, work progressed at a pace that left rival guilds bewildered. Teams could adjust scaffolding in mid-air, responding to shifts in wind or weight as fluidly as a falcon adjusting its wings. The falconer's knowledge of balance and trajectory, once reserved for hunting, now ensured that every block and beam found its perfect alignment. Even the masons, initially skeptical of bird tricks, grew to rely on the system, their hands unconsciously mirroring the falconers' signals as they worked. But the true brilliance lay in the trust it demanded. Falconry had taught the Falconer's Daughter that control wasn't about force, it was about partnership. A bird obeyed not out of fear, but because it believed in the hand that guided it. Similarly, the construction crews didn't follow silent orders blindly. They trusted that every gesture had been honed by years of collaboration. That mutual respect transformed the site from a collection of laborers into a single organism, moving with the synchronized grace of a flock in flight. Their first major project together, a bell tower for the Abbey of St. Arnulf, became the testament to their synergy. Unlike traditional towers which rose rigid and straight, this one spiraled gently, its outer stairs winding like the grooves of a feather's shaft. The design allowed the bells to swing without shaking the structure, their vibrations channeled downward like the tremors of a peregrine's landing. When the bishop marveled at its stability during a storm, the architect's son simply pointed to the Falconer's Daughter and traced a circle in the air, their silent signal for perfect balance. It was more than a building, it was a conversation between earth and sky, crafted in a language only they could speak. The Cathedral of the Sky didn't just rise from the ground, it burst into the heavens as if the stones themselves had grown wings. From the moment the first cornerstone was laid, it was clear this was no ordinary place of worship. Its spires, slender and tapered like a falcon's talons, pierced the clouds, while its ribbed vaults arched with the same effortless grace as a bird in flight. But the true marvel revealed itself at dawn, when the sun's first rays streamed through the eastern windows, casting a spectacle no medieval eye had ever witnessed. The stained glass, meticulously designed with hidden layers of color and lead, projected a shadow play across the nave, a flock of falcons in mid-dive, their silhouettes stretching and shrinking as the sun climbed. Pilgrims would arrive hours before sunrise just to watch the phenomenon, whispering that the birds were angels made visible. Even the cathedral's acoustics defied convention. The architect's son had studied the way falconers' calls carried across valleys, their tones sharp and clear even over great distances. He shaped the choir loft like the curved beak of a raptor, funneling voices downward so every chant, every hymn resonated with unnatural clarity. A visiting bishop famously dropped his prayer book during Mass, startled by how distinctly he could hear the rustle of its pages from 50 paces away. "This is no mere building," he wrote in his diary. "It listens as we speak to God." The king's reaction became legend. Upon entering the completed cathedral for the first time, he reportedly paused at the threshold, his hand trembling against the doorframe. As he walked the length of the nave, his eyes traced the carved capitals, each one depicting not saints or biblical scenes, but falcons mid-hunt, their wings spread in perpetual motion. When he reached the altar, where a single shaft of light illuminated a mosaic of a dove ascending, chroniclers claim he wept openly. "I have seen palaces and fortresses," he allegedly confessed to his advisors, "but never have I stood inside a prayer made stone." What made the cathedral revolutionary wasn't just its beauty, but its defiance of medieval engineering dogma. Traditional architects had always built to resist nature, thick walls to block wind, heavy buttresses to counter gravity. But this structure worked with the elements, its design borrowing from the Falconer's Daughter's intimate knowledge of airflow and balance. The bell tower, for instance, didn't fight storms. It swayed slightly, like a sapling bending in a gale, its foundations reinforced with the same flexible fibers used in falconry hoods. During a particularly violent tempest, townspeople watched in horror as the spire leaned alarmingly to one side, only to snap back upright when the winds passed unharmed. The project became a blueprint for their future collaborations, proving that their family's combined wisdom could birth something neither could achieve alone. But for every noble who marveled at the cathedral's innovations, there were a dozen traditionalists who called it heresy. Guild masters sneered at the Falconers' Daughter's suggestions, insisting that bird tricks had no place in sacred architecture. A faction of bishops condemned the animal motifs as pagan, demanding the carvings be chiseled away. Even some stonemasons balked at the new techniques, grumbling that no proper craftsman should take lessons from creatures of the air. Yet the cathedral stood, unshaken by criticism, unbroken by storms, and with each passing year, its success chipped away at the old ways. Younger architects began sketching designs with tapered spires and fluid lines, while falconers found themselves consulted on everything from bridge construction to town planning. The resistance never fully vanished, but it no longer mattered. The Cathedral of the Sky had already done the impossible. It had taught a generation to look upward, not in prayer alone, but in inspiration. And as the Falconer's Daughter often reminded her critics, even the mightiest oak begins as a seed unwilling to stay buried. The monk's quill scratched across the parchment with furious indignation. To build as the birds do is to defy divine order. Stone was made to bear weight, not mimic the follies of fowl. His chronicle, buried in the abbey's archives, was just one voice in a chorus of medieval skepticism. Traditionalists saw the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son as upending centuries of sacred geometry, their designs branded as reckless, even blasphemous. A guild master from Chartres famously threw his gloves at the architect's feet, snarling that no true mason would take lessons from creatures without souls. Even the cathedral's own laborers hesitated at first, their hands trembling as they laid stones at angles no textbook sanctioned. But the critics hadn't accounted for the most persuasive argument of all: the buildings simply worked. When a winter gale toppled the older abbey's tower while the new cathedral's spire swayed unharmed, even the loudest detractors fell silent. The Falconer's Daughter, ever pragmatic, invited the doubters to witness her birds in action. "Watch how the goshawk lands on a thin branch," she'd say, pointing to the way its wings cupped the air to disperse force. "Now tell me again that nature's geometry is folly." Slowly, begrudgingly, the evidence wore resistance down. A stonemason who'd once crossed himself at the sight of a falcon-carved capital began copying the designs for his own village chapel. A bishop who'd condemned the beastly motifs commissioned a window depicting doves, a concession wrapped in scripture, but a concession nonetheless. Royal patronage proved their greatest shield. The king, enthralled by the cathedral's innovations, declared their methods crown-sanctioned, silencing threats of excommunication with a wave of his ringed hand. His endorsement wasn't just political, it was personal. After a falconry demonstration where the architect's son explained how a bird's hollow bones inspired their lighter vaulting, the king reportedly quipped, "If God gave wings to hawks, why not to his houses?" His support opened doors quite literally. Soon, the families were designing everything from royal hunting lodges with eyrie-like towers to granaries ventilated like woven nests. The next generation absorbed these lessons before they could walk. The Falconer's Daughter's youngest child, a girl with her mother's sharp eyes, would toddle to construction sites with a toy wooden hawk, testing the wind like the masons did. The architect's son's apprentices, many of them orphans taken in by the guild, learned to sketch alongside falconers, their parchments filled with both rib vaults and wing diagrams. A visiting scholar from Bologna once gasped upon finding a 12-year-old tracing the path of a swallow's flight to plot a stairwell's curve. "This is no mere craft," he wrote. "It is a new language whispered between species." By the time the original critics died, their complaints buried with them, the family's legacy had already taken root. The cathedral's success spawned imitators across Europe, spires that bent like barley in the wind, cloisters where rainwater channeled away as if guided by invisible talons. What began as heresy had become orthodoxy, proof that tradition could evolve without breaking. And though the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son would never live to see their ideas crown distant skylines, they'd left something more enduring than stone, the unshakable belief that progress often wears feathers. The Falconer's Daughter knelt in the meadow, her hands steady as she guided her youngest child's fingers along the edge of a young goshawk's wing. "Feel how the feathers lock together," she murmured, watching the girl's eyes widen at the discovery. Nearby, the architect's son sat cross-legged with his own child, a boy of 7 whose charcoal moved feverishly across parchment, capturing not just the bird's shape, but the way the Falconer's Daughter tilted her head, the exact angle of trust between human and hawk. This wasn't just a lesson in craft, it was the passing of a torch, the careful weaving of 2 families' wisdom into the next generation's hands. The children learned as their parents had, through patience and partnership. The girl's first solo flight with a merlin ended in disaster when the bird refused to return, vanishing into the woods for 3 agonizing days. Instead of scolding her, the Falconer's Daughter led her to the forest's edge at dawn, whispering, "Listen for her bells. She's not lost, she's testing you." When the merlin finally swooped back to the girl's outstretched glove, the victory wasn't just in the retrieval, but in the lesson etched deeper than any rebuke: trust is earned, not demanded. Meanwhile, the architect's son taught his boy to read the language of stone, letting him press his palms against half-carved blocks to feel the hidden fissures. A cathedral's strength, he'd say, isn't in ignoring its flaws but in building around them. Their teachings transcended technique. The Falconer's Daughter wove discipline into every lesson, insisting her children rise before the sun to train, not because the birds demanded it, but because the sky doesn't wait for the unprepared. The architect's son fostered curiosity, challenging his apprentices to solve problems with materials they'd never used, once handing them only willow twigs and rope to design a bridge. Limitations, he'd say, are where invention begins. Together, they nurtured courage, the kind that let a 12-year-old girl propose redesigning a dovecote after studying swallows' nests, or a boy defend an unorthodox arch designed to sneering guild masters. The proof of their legacy emerged in the children's first collaborative project, a chapel whose spire twisted like a kestrel's spiral dive, its interior lit by windows arranged like the layered feathers of a falcon's wing. The girl, now 14, had insisted on a perch outside the choir loft, where wild hawks could rest mid-migration, a touch the local bishop initially called profane, until he witnessed the birds' silent presence during Vespers, their stillness mirroring the congregation's reverence. The boy, just a year older, had devised a way to channel their droppings into the mortar mix, strengthening the walls with a technique borrowed from cliff nesting raptors. It was brilliance born of 2 worlds colliding, a harmony their parents had only dreamed of, but shadows loomed on the horizon. Wars between rival duchies threatened the kingdom's peace, and with it the patronage that fueled their ambitions. Supply routes for stone and glass were cut off by marauding bands. Falconry grounds became battlegrounds. Yet even as the world fractured, the families clung to their shared language, the silent signals, the trust in unseen currents. When soldiers requisitioned the cathedral's bells for cannon metal, the Falconer's Daughter's children smuggled the smallest one into the hills, hiding it in a cave where hawks nested. The architect's son's apprentices, now young men, dismantled their scaffolds under cover of darkness, repurposing the wood into shelters for refugees. Crisis didn't break their legacy. It revealed its true strength not in stone or feather, but in the unshakable belief that even the darkest storms could be weathered with wings spread wide. War came not with warning, but with the acrid scent of burning thatch on the wind. The first raiding parties struck at dawn, their torches staining the horizon red as they advanced toward the half-finished cathedral. The Falconer's Daughter stood atop the scaffolding, her peregrine restless on her glove, as the architect's son scrambled up beside her with a roll of blueprints clutched like a shield. Below, masons dropped their chisels for swords, but the two families knew their greatest weapons weren't forged of steel. They were written in the language of wings and stone. Within days, the cathedral's workshops became a war room of unorthodox strategies. The falconers' birds, once trained to hunt hares, now carried parchment-thin messages between besieged towns, their routes tracing paths too high for enemy arrows. A gyrfalcon named Tempest became legend for darting through a storm to deliver a plea for reinforcements, her feathers slick with rain but the ink on her scroll untouched. Meanwhile, the architect's son studied the falconers' trapping techniques, how they used nets weighted just so, how a snare's tension could be adjusted with a flick of the wrist, and adapted them into defenses. Gate hinges were reworked to mimic the silent pivot of an owl's neck, allowing portcullises to drop without warning. Curtain walls were angled like a falcon's dive, deflecting siege ladders as effortlessly as a bird sheds rain. Yet for all their ingenuity, loss was inevitable. The morning they found the bell tower's base cracked by a trebuchet's blow, the architect's son sank to his knees in the rubble, his fingers tracing the fractures like wounds. The Falconer's Daughter, wordless, placed a hand on his shoulder, then stiffened as a distant screech pierced the smoke. High above, her eldest falcon circled the damaged spire, not fleeing but assessing, as if calculating how to rebuild. That moment became their rallying cry. While others saw ruins, they saw a chance to refine. The tower's reconstruction incorporated new tricks, mortar mixed with crushed seashells for flexibility, scaffolding rigged to rotate like a falcon's perch, allowing masons to work from all angles without dismantling. The war's darkest nights birthed their most tender collaborations. Huddled in candlelit crypts, the Falconer's Daughter would sketch flight patterns in the dust while the architect's son explained how stress traveled through stone. Their children, now teenagers, devised a system of hollow chimneys that let smoke escape without revealing a fortress's position, a design inspired by how owls silent their wing beats. Even in chaos, their bond deepened. One frigid evening, as the architect's son repaired a shattered stained glass falcon with lead and grit, the Falconer's Daughter pressed a steaming cup into his hands. "Drink," she murmured. "The glass can wait, the dawn can't." He glanced up, realizing she'd memorized his habit of working until collapse. That simple act, the warmth of the cup, the quiet understanding, anchored him more firmly than any cornerstone. By the war's end, their creations bore scars but stood defiant. The cathedral's new spire, though shorter, curved like a falcon's protective wing over the nave. Villagers whispered that on still nights you could hear the bells chime in harmony with distant hawk cries, a testament to what endures when craft is fueled by resilience. And when peace finally returned, the families didn't just rebuild, they reimagined. The architect's son designed granaries with ventilation shafts shaped like a kestrel's nostrils, ensuring grain stayed dry without costly repairs. The Falconer's Daughter trained ravens to scout unstable terrain ahead of construction crews, their keen eyes spotting sinkholes before carts could plunge into them. War had taught them this. Destruction could unravel the work of years, but ingenuity, once woven into the fabric of a community, became as unbreakable as the bond between those who dared to build together. The entrance to the architect's home was unassuming, a simple oak door, worn smooth by generations of hands. But if you knelt to brush away the dust near the threshold, you'd find it, a tiny falcon carved into the stone lintel, wings half spread as if caught mid-takeoff. No one else would notice it, but the Falconer's Daughter had traced that carving with her fingers 100 times, recognizing the stroke of his chisel as clearly as she knew the call of her birds. It was a secret, a whisper in stone, proof that their partnership had long since blurred into something more. Letters between them, preserved in the Abbey's archives, reveal a bond deeper than collaboration. One parchment, brittle with age, bears the architect's son's handwriting. "You asked why I sketch birds so often. It's not their flight I study, but the moment before, that heartbeat when the wings tense and the air holds its breath. That's how I feel when you walk into the workshop." The Falconer's Daughter's reply, ink smudged as if written in haste. "Then you'll understand why I bring my dear falcon to your scaffolds. Not to hunt, but to watch you work. You build as she flies without apology." Their love, if that's what it was, never needed declarations. It lived in the way he'd pause mid-sentence when she entered a room, as if recalibrating his thoughts to her presence. In the way she'd save the season's first game bird for his table, though falconers were supposed to sell such prizes. Most of all, it thrived in their work. The cathedral's rose window, where the glass falcons seemed to spiral toward a central dove, their flight paths converging in stained glass harmony. The mason's yard gossip claimed the architect's son redesigned that window 3 times, refusing to settle until the light cast a falcon's shadow across the nave at noon, a fleeting kiss of sun and stone only visible when she stood in a certain spot. Yet their greatest legacy wasn't in these quiet gestures, but in the innovations they birthed together. The Falconer's Daughter's knowledge of avian anatomy inspired the first true ribbed vaults, their weight distributed like a bird's hollow bones. The architect's son's obsession with acoustics led to bell towers that sang rather than clanged, their resonance tuned to mimic a peregrine's territorial call. Even their quarrels bore fruit. After a heated debate about wind resistance, they devised the precursor to the modern weather vane, a rotating falcon atop the Guildhall that predicted storms by aligning with oncoming gusts. Visitors often asked how 2 such different souls could create so seamlessly. The answer was etched into every joint and keystone they touched. They didn't just share a life. They shared a language, one where a flick of the wrist could mean steady the rope or I trust you, where a carved feather in an unseen corner was both an engineering reference and a love note. And perhaps that's why their buildings still stand centuries later, while grander monuments have crumbled. Stone and feather, earth and sky, calculation and instinct, they proved that the strongest foundations aren't made of mortar, but of the invisible threads that bind 2 hearts to a single purpose. The secret to their arches wasn't in the stone, but in the jesses, the tiny leather straps falconers used to tether their birds. One rainy afternoon, the Falconer's Daughter noticed how the tension in a goshawk's jess mirrored the stress lines in the architect's son's latest blueprint. "Adjust the straps like this," she demonstrated, loosening one side slightly, "and the weight distributes evenly across the bird's leg." That simple observation revolutionized their construction. By threading weighted cords through scale models of arches mimicking the precise give and take of falconry gear, they could predict exactly where a full-size structure would bear stress. Centuries before modern engineers invented load testing equipment, these medieval innovators were calibrating cathedrals with tools from a falconer's kit. Their methods bordered on alchemy. While most builders relied on rule-of-thumb measurements passed down through guilds, the architect's son insisted on recording every experiment, failed or successful, in codices filled with sketches of bird bones, wing spreads, and feather overlaps. One parchment, now housed in the Bodleian Library, shows a peregrine's wing beside a vaulted ceiling, with notes detailing how the secondary feathers overlap inspired a new way to layer stone. "Observe first," the Falconer's Daughter often reminded him, "then build." It was an empirical approach that wouldn't become mainstream until the Renaissance, yet here they were, applying the scientific method to everything from mortar mixtures to acoustics. Take their most playful innovation, falcon-assisted land surveying. Before breaking ground on a new abbey, they'd release a falcon with a weighted line tied to its leg, letting the bird's natural aversion to turbulence reveal wind patterns across the site. Where the falcon banked sharply, they knew to reinforce walls. Where it glided smoothly, they positioned windows. Modern aerodynamic engineers would later confirm their findings. Those falcons were instinctively mapping wind shear and turbulence zones with pinpoint accuracy. But their brilliance wasn't just technical, it was cultural. By proving that nature's designs could solve human problems, they challenged the medieval mindset that saw the natural world as something to dominate. Suddenly, apprentices studied birds as intently as blueprints. A stonemason might pause mid-chisel to watch swallows dart through an arch, noting how their abrupt turns required no buttresses. Even the church took notice, commissioning bestiaries that framed animals as God's engineers rather than mere symbols. The ripple effects reached beyond architecture. Farmers redesigned plows after studying how falcons' beaks parted grass, while musicians tuned lutes to mimic the harmonic frequencies of hawk cries. Their greatest lesson wasn't about stone or feathers, but about perspective. In an age when knowledge was often hoarded like gold, they shared openly, turning their workshop into a crossroads where falconers debated with masons and bishops traded texts with blacksmiths. That collaborative spirit, rooted in curiosity rather than dogma, would outlast every cathedral they built. Today, when engineers use biomimicry to design earthquake-resistant buildings or drones that fly like birds, they're walking a path first cleared by a falconer's keen eye and an architect's restless chisel. Their legacy didn't just reshape stone, it rewrote the medieval imagination. Walk into any great hall of the era, and you'd find tapestries where falcons perched on gargoyles like sentinels, their embroidered wings mirroring the vaulted ceilings above. Poets penned verses comparing spires to heaven's talons, and illuminated manuscripts bordered their sacred texts with intricate knotwork inspired by falconry jesses. Even the humblest village baker might stamp his loaves with a bird and arch motif, a silent nod to the partnership that had redefined beauty itself. Take the famous tapestry of the Skyward Hunt in Burgundy, where thread of gold falcons dive between woven cathedral towers, their trajectories forming perfect geometric patterns. Art historians once assumed this was mere decoration until someone noticed the angles matched actual flight paths from the Falconers' Daughter's training logs. Every swoop and turn was a lesson in physics disguised as art. Similarly, the Codex of St. Arnulf contains hymns praising the builder who walked with birds, its margins filled with sketches of keystones shaped like clutching talons. What began as engineering had become liturgy. Towns fortunate enough to house their structures blossomed into cultural crossroads. Pilgrims no longer traveled just to touch relics. They came to witness the living cathedrals where light and shadow performed daily miracles. In Charters, vendors sold tiny lead falcons to press into prayer books. In Reims, children played a game called Spire and Hawk, racing to stack stones while balancing a feather on their noses. Regional pride transformed into something fiercer, a sense of identity woven into the very skyline. One particularly cold winter, when snow erased all roads to the Cathedral of the Sky, a miracle was born. Lost travelers swore a white gyrfalcon appeared mid-blizzard, circling thrice before leading them to the sanctuary's doors. By spring, the story had spread like wildfire, embellished with claims the bird's eyes gleamed like stained glass. Soon, every tavern from Paris to Prague had its own version. Some said the falcon was the Archangel Michael's messenger, others that it was the Falconer's Daughter's spirit watching over her work. The truth mattered less than the wonder it inspired. After their deaths, myth eclipsed memory. Farmers whispered that touching one of their buildings could cure a falcon's broken wing. Minstrels sang of the architect's son conversing with owls to learn the moon's secrets. A particularly fanciful chronicle claimed the two had secretly wed atop a half-finished spire, their vows carried away by the very birds that brought them together. These tales, though wild, held a kernel of truth. Their partnership had become a prism through which medieval society reimagined the possible. Perhaps the most poignant legend comes from the workshop where they first met. Locals swore that on certain evenings, if the light fell just right through the west window, you could see two shadows against the wall, one with hands outstretched as if holding a bird, the other tracing arches in the dust. Not ghosts, they insisted, but a reminder. Some collaborations are so indelible they outlast even time. Legends have a way of taking root where history leaves gaps, and the story of the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son was no exception. Within decades of their deaths, whispers began swirling that their spirits lingered among the very stones they'd shaped. Travelers claimed to see a ghostly falcon circling the cathedral at dusk, its cries harmonizing with the evening bells. Masons swore that on foggy mornings their blueprints would shift slightly overnight, as if invisible hands had adjusted a keystone's angle, the most enduring myth. That the two still walked the scaffolding together, their laughter carried away by the wind. But peel back the layers of these tales, and you'll find something far more revealing than ghost stories. Medieval society didn't just invent these legends, it needed them. In an era where most laborers toiled anonymously, the idea that craftsmanship could be so extraordinary it defied death was revolutionary. A ballad from the 1400s, The Falcon and the Spire, captures this perfectly. It describes the architect's son carving his love's likeness into a hidden corbel, where the stone breathes when the moon is high. Historians point out the inaccuracy. The real couple likely never married, but the ballad's deeper truth resonates. Their partnership symbolized a perfect union of skill and soul, something so rare it transcended mortal limits. What's fascinating is how these myths mirrored medieval values. The falcon's recurring presence wasn't just poetic. It reflected the belief that mastery of a craft bound the artisan to their tools eternally. Just as a saint's relics held power, so too did the falconer's glove or the architect's compass become sacred by association. Even the story's inaccuracies, like claims the duo could commune with birds, reveal a cultural yearning to bridge the divide between human ingenuity and nature's wisdom. Yet for all the magic woven into their legend, the most astonishing proof of their legacy isn't spectral, it's tangible. Visit the Cathedral of St. Arnulf today, and you can still trace your fingers along the feathered ribs of its vaults, each groove worn smooth by centuries of hand. In the town square of Clermont, a weathered stone falcon perches atop the old Guildhall, its wings so precisely angled that it whistles in a north wind, a trick the architect's son borrowed from hunting whistles. And high in the Pyrenees, shepherds guide flocks using cairns stacked in a spiral pattern first sketched in the Falconer's Daughter's journals. The real magic lies in how their innovations outran their myths. Modern engineers studying the cathedral's vaults discovered the ribs distribute weight almost identically to a bird's wing bones, a principle now used in suspension bridges. Ornithologists recently confirmed that the falconry techniques she documented align startlingly with contemporary avian science. Even the superstitious practice of aligning windows with bird migration paths. Turns out it created natural ventilation systems that kept medieval buildings drier than their neighbors. So next time you hear the old ballad's refrain, stone may crumble, feather may fray, but what they built no wind can sway. Remember this, the greatest legends aren't just stories we tell. They're truths we've yet to fully measure, And somewhere between the myths and the mortar, between the ballads and the blueprints, their real magic still flies. Centuries may have passed, but the fingerprints of the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son are still pressed into the modern world, sometimes in places you'd least expect. Take the Abbey of St. Arnulf, where tourists crane their necks at the famous Whispering Vaults. Tilt your head just right beneath those arches, and you'll hear a murmur carry 50 paces, a trick of acoustics borrowed directly from the falconer's hunting calls. Or visit the workshop in Clermont, now a museum, where the original weighted cords used to test arch stability still hang beside displays of modern engineering tools. The parallels are uncanny. Today's architects use computer models to simulate stress points, but the principle remains unchanged from those first crude, Jess-inspired experiments. For a living link to the past, meet Elias, a fifth-generation falconer who trains birds using methods straight from the daughter's playbook. Watch him work with a young peregrine, and you'll see history in motion. The same deliberate patience, the same subtle glove signals, even the same leather hoods stitched with a telltale knot pattern unique to their lineage. She left notes on everything, Elias says, smoothing a parchment-thin training journal from the 1400s. How to calm a bird after a failed hunt, how to read the weather in their feathers. We've added radios and GPS trackers, but the core, that's hers. Meanwhile, modern architects are rediscovering their genius. Walk through any city, and you'll spot their influence, not just in Gothic revivals, but in cutting-edge designs. That skyscraper with the tapered, aerodynamic spire, its wind resistance calculations mirror the Falcon's dive. The solar panels on a Berlin concert hall, angled like overlapping feathers to maximize light capture. A direct descendant of their observations, even disaster relief tents now borrow from the Falconer's collapsible transport cages, proving their ideas weren't just beautiful, they were timelessly functional. Imagine what they could do today. With drones mapping wind currents in real time, would the architect's son design bridges that flex like a kestrel's wings? Would the Falconer's Daughter use thermal imaging to track bird migrations, applying those paths to urban planning? The question isn't just speculative, it's a challenge. Their story whispers to us across the ages. Collaboration isn't about merging skills, but magnifying them. When a biologist teams up with a robotics engineer to create drones that fly like falcons, or when a sculptor consults with a meteorologist to craft public art that harnesses the wind, the spirit of those two medieval visionaries lives on. So the next time you pass a building that seems to breathe with its environment, or watch a falconer's bird return effortlessly to the glove, pause. You're not just seeing history preserved, you're witnessing a dialogue that never ended, a testament to what happens when we dare to learn from unlikely teachers. Their greatest lesson wasn't in stone or feather, but in the courage to look up and ask, what if we tried it their way? Unity wasn't just something they practiced, it was the very air they breathed. The Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son showed the world that the most profound breakthroughs don't come from doubling down on what you already know, but from daring to stand where two worlds collide. Think of their partnership like a medieval version of a modern tech startup, where a coder and a designer speaking entirely different creative languages somehow build an app that changes how we live. The falconer understood wind currents like a poet understands meter. The architect reads stress lines in stone like a musician reads sheet music. Alone, they were masters of their crafts. Together, they rewrote the rules of what was possible. This alchemy of opposites isn't confined to history books. Look around today, and you'll see their legacy alive in places like Silicon Valley, where biologists team up with AI engineers to mimic photosynthesis in solar panels, or in hospitals where surgeons collaborate with virtual reality artists to prepare for complex operations. The magic happens in the friction between disciplines, in the moment someone asks, "What if we tried it your way?" That's the lesson etched into every stone they left behind. Brilliance isn't just about skill, it's about synergy. So how do you find your own architect if you're a falconer, or vice versa? Start by looking for the gaps in your work, the problems that keep you awake at night, the solutions that feel just out of reach. Then seek out those who speak in languages foreign to you. Maybe you're a teacher struggling to engage students. What could a game designer teach you about motivation? Perhaps you're a farmer battling soil erosion. What insights might a textile artist weaving resilient fabrics offer? The Falconer's Daughter didn't just admire the architect's blueprints, she saw in them a map of the sky. Their story also casts medieval family dynasties in a surprising new light. We often picture these lineages as insular, passing down secrets like locked heirlooms. But the great dynasties, the stonemasons of Chartres, the glassmakers of Venice, thrived not by hoarding knowledge but by forging alliances. A blacksmith's daughter married into a family of shipwrights, and suddenly iron nails gave way to revolutionary hull designs. A scribe's son apprenticed with a brewer, and accounting led to innovations in fermentation. Like the falconers and architects, these families discovered that bloodlines mattered less than idea lines, the invisible threads connecting disparate minds. What made their bond extraordinary wasn't just what they built, but how they built it, with a humility that let them kneel before each other's expertise. The architect's son could have dismissed bird flight as irrelevant to cathedrals. The falconer's daughter might have scoffed at stonework as earth-bound drudgery. Instead, they met in the middle, where feathers and stone became poetry. That's the invitation their story extends to us, not just to collaborate, but to translate, to find the hidden music in another's craft and let it tune your own. After all, the future isn't built by specialists alone, but by those brave enough to let their skills take flight in someone else's sky. Medieval Europe brimmed with powerful dynasties, bankers like the Medici weaving gold through politics, stonemason guilds hoarding architectural secrets like dragon's treasure, knightly families etching their names in blood-stained chronicles. But what made the falconers and architects' families different wasn't their wealth or weaponry. It was their refusal to see boundaries where others saw walls. While the Medicis bought influence with coin, these clans traded something far more revolutionary: knowledge. Take the master masons of Chartres, who guarded their vaulting techniques like state secrets, punishing apprentices for sharing so much as a keystone's angle. Contrast that with the architect's father, who once hosted a feast for rival guilds just to demonstrate how falconry ropes could lift heavier stones. Or consider the Fuggers, the banking dynasty whose ledgers could topple kings, yet never thought to finance an experiment between, say, a blacksmith and a silk weaver. The Falconer's Daughter's family, meanwhile, turned their muse into a classroom, inviting stonemasons to observe how a goshawk's landing redistributed weight. This wasn't isolation. Medieval history whispers with collaborations we've forgotten. The non-herbalists who worked alongside battlefield surgeons, their gardens yielding both salves and siege antidotes, the shipwrights who studied spiderwebs to reinforce hulls, the illuminators who borrowed alchemists' pigments to make manuscripts glow like stained glass. What set our families apart wasn't that they collaborated, it was how they institutionalized it. Their workshops became crossroads where disciplines didn't just meet, but married. A telling example lies in the Strasbourg Masons' Lodge records from 1423, which grumble about bird-minded fools reshaping local guild rules. The complaint: the Falconer's Daughter had convinced the carpenters to adopt feather-light scaffolding techniques, having construction accidents. Within decades, Strasbourg's lodge would mandate apprentices spend a season with falconers, proof that their radical openness wasn't just effective, it was contagious. Yet for all their influence, nothing prepared them for the crisis that would cement their legacy. The year the plague returned, it wasn't just lives it claimed, it was memory. Master craftsmen died mid-sentence, their secrets buried with them. The architect's son, then leading the cathedral's final spire, found himself surrounded by terrified apprentices who'd never learned to carve a proper rib vault. That's when the Falconer's Daughter did the unthinkable. She opened her family's treasured training manuals, centuries of closely guarded falconry wisdom, and handed them to the masons. "If a bird can teach balance," she said, "so can parchment." Together, they cross-referenced aerodynamic principles with stonework, creating emergency templates that saved half-finished churches across the region. In that moment of shared survival, the last barrier between their crafts dissolved. The lesson: great dynasties aren't built on what they keep, but on what they dare to give away. Their final collaboration wasn't a soaring cathedral or a fortress spire. It was a humble pilgrim's bridge spanning a restless mountain stream. By then, the architect's hands trembled too much to hold a chisel steady, and the Falconer's Daughter's once keen eyes now squinted against the light. Yet when the village elders begged them to replace the rotting wooden bridge that claimed 2 lives each winter, they couldn't refuse. This would be their swan song in stone, a quiet masterpiece where every element whispered of lessons learned across a lifetime. The bridge's genius lay in its simplicity. Instead of fighting the stream's violent spring floods, its 3 arches mimicked the spread wings of a heron mid-strike, each curve calculated to let water pass through rather than batter against. Apprentices did the heavy lifting under exacting supervision, the architect's son correcting angles with a walking stick in the dirt, the Falconer's Daughter directing stone placements by listening to the current's rush like she once read wind in her bird's feathers. Not higher, she'd call over the noise, wider, like a goshawk's tail breaking before landing. The masons marveled at how the finished piers seemed to grip the riverbed like talons, their foundations studded with the very seashells she'd once noticed prevented erosion along coastal cliffs. On the day of completion, as villagers gathered for the blessing, the Falconer's Daughter climbed the scaffolding one last time, ignoring protests, to mount a small bronze falcon atop the central keystone. Not a saint, not a cross, but a bird in mid-dive, its wings angled precisely to turn with the wind. "Let it warn travelers of storms," she told the crowd, running her thumb over the falcon's beak in a private farewell. Those who stood close swore they saw the architect's son press her other hand briefly to his lips before helping her down. In their final years, they often sat together on that bridge, watching swallows nest in its arches. The architect's son would chuckle at how perfectly the birds' mud nests adhered to the textured stone, another unintentional gift from studying falconry rope's grip. The Falconer's Daughter, her once raven hair now white as a gyrfalcon's breast, liked to listen for the bridge's secret. When the wind blew just right through its hollow spandrels, it whistled the same 5-note call she'd used to summon her first Merlin. Their reflections on legacy surprised even their families. "I thought we were building monuments," the architect's son confessed one evening as fireflies danced above the stream. "Turns out we were building conversations." He meant not just between their crafts, but across generations, the way his young grandson now studied hawk migrations to plan garden walls, how her great-niece used ancient vaulting tricks to design dovecotes. The true test of their work wasn't in the stones that stood, but in the minds they'd reshaped. When the old bridge finally succumbed to time centuries later, villagers salvaged that bronze falcon, passing it down like a sacred relic. Today, it spins above a schoolhouse in the valley, still turning with the wind, still teaching without words, proof that the smallest creations often outlast the grandest when forged by hands that truly understood how earth and sky could dance together. Twilight settled over the stone bench where they sat, its surface worn smooth by decades of shared evenings. The architect's son traced a fingertip along a crack in the masonry, smiling as he recognized the repair, one of his first apprentice's clumsy but earnest work. "Remember when young Tomas dropped the keystone?" he murmured, his voice roughened by age. The falconer's daughter chuckled, her hands cradling a steaming cup of mint tea. "He cried like a just hawk," she said, "until you showed him how to mix the mortar with crushed pottery shards, said it was your secret recipe." Their laughter curled into the chill air, mingling with the distant calls of returning swallows. Their conversations in those final years were less about triumph than gratitude for the students who'd surpassed them, for the quiet miracles of everyday endurance. "Did you see Clara's new infirmary?" the falconer's daughter asked one evening, watching a skein of geese arrow across the sunset. Buttresses like a falcon's pinions, wide enough to shelter the sick, light enough to let the walls breathe. The architect's son nodded, pride softening his weathered face. "Better than anything I designed. She took your notes on feather ventilation," and he pantomimed an explosion with his hands, making her grin. Even as their bodies faltered, their minds remained sharp as ever. On bitter winter nights, they'd pore over apprentices' sketches by firelight, the architect's son annotating margins with trembling but precise strokes, the falconer's daughter demonstrating aerodynamics with ash-streaked parchment. "This curve," she'd insist, folding a corner to mimic a kestrel's wing, "needs to give like a bird riding the wind, not fight it." Their critiques always ended the same way: "Now break the rules." That's how we got here. The Village Chronicle records their last public appearance, a spring festival where the youngest mason and falconer presented a collaborative design for a dovecote. Bent with age but bright-eyed, they listened as the apprentices explained how the structure's spiral interior mimicked a peregrine's dive path to deter predators. Afterward, the architect's son reportedly whispered to his lifelong friend, "We've built more than stone and feather. We've built a way of thinking." When the falconer's daughter passed first, the architect's son insisted her coffin be lined with the same downy hemp she'd used for nesting bags, her hands folded around a fragment of stained glass from their first collaboration. He followed her within the year, his last request a simple one: to be buried with his compass pointed toward the cathedral's spire, so the shadow of their greatest work would trace his resting place like a sundial. The morning that followed defied medieval custom. Falconers and masons alike wore unstitched gloves for a full turning of the seasons, a fusion of their trades' traditional grieving gestures. The guilds suspended all construction for 3 days, an unprecedented honor, and high on the cathedral's spire, where no one could reach, someone, perhaps one of their students, tied a weathered falconry bell to the highest finial. On windy days, its chime carried across the city, clear and bright as a hunter's call. The townsfolk swore it rang loudest during storms, as if reminding the stones how to dance. The falconer's daughter's funeral procession moved through the city at dawn, a silent river of gray cloaks and lowered hoods. But when her casket reached the hilltop cemetery, the pallbearers paused, not for a speech or a prayer, but for the untying of 12 leather jesses. One by one, her prized birds were released into the morning sky, their bells chiming as they circled upward. The gyrfalcon went last, its wings beating slow and heavy, as if it understood this wasn't a hunt but a farewell. Down in the valley, the architect's son, too frail by then to climb the hill, stood at his workshop window, watching the falcons vanish into the light. When the last speck disappeared, he turned to his apprentices and whispered, "Now we build her a monument the wind will never forget." Their tombs became classrooms in stone. The falconer's daughter's sarcophagus bore carvings not of angels, but of falcons mid-molt, their feathers overlapping like the shingles of a roof, a subtle lesson in waterproofing techniques she'd adapted from avian down. The architect's son's resting place, meanwhile, was etched with the blueprint of his first chapel, its margins filled with equations so precise, generations of masons would later use them to teach geometry. Even in death, they resisted the medieval urge to depict saints or crosses. Instead, their epitaphs celebrated curiosity. Hers read, "She listened when the wind spoke." His, "He taught stone to fly." The paradox was undeniable. Their bodies returned to earth, yet their ideas seemed to grow lighter with time. Within a decade, pilgrims left not just flowers at their graves, but offerings of charcoal and leather, tools of the trades they'd elevated. A traveling monk's journal from 1483 describes a young girl kneeling at the Falconer's Daughter's tomb, carefully copying the feather patterns into her sketchbook while a merlin watched from a nearby yew tree. "The dead here do not rest," he wrote, "but teach." Their families carried the torch without missing a beat. The Falconer's Daughter's niece revolutionized messenger bird networks during a siege, using techniques cribbed from her aunt's notes on migratory paths. The architect's son's grandson, barely 20, redesigned Amsterdam's floodgates after studying how ospreys plunge into water without losing speed. Even their rivals couldn't deny the legacy's pull. A once dismissive guildmaster was caught plagiarizing the falcon-inspired buttress design for his own cathedral, later justifying it as honoring the masters. What made their memory endure wasn't just brilliance but generosity. They'd left behind not just buildings and trained birds, but something radical for their era: open access. Their workshops became libraries, their apprentices turned teachers, their failures documented as meticulously as their triumphs. In an age when most craftsmen guarded secrets like crowns, their willingness to share turned their gravesites into unlikely crossroads where stonemasons left chisels as tribute. Falconers tied jesses to the iron railings, and once in a while, on the anniversary of their passing, someone would still release a single falcon into the dawn. Not to summon it back, but to let it go. The children of the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son didn't just inherit their parents' tools, they inherited a way of seeing the world. By the time the Renaissance dawned, their descendants had scattered across Europe like seeds on the wind, each carrying fragments of that original partnership. In Florence, a great-grandson of the architect's son pored over his ancestors' sketches with a new intensity, recognizing in those feather-inspired arches the same principles Leonardo da Vinci was scribbling in his notebooks. The young man, Matteo, would later design a chapel dome so light it seemed to float, its ribs tapered like the primary feathers of a stooping peregrine, a direct homage to the family's medieval roots. Meanwhile, in the court of Henry VIII, a fiery-haired falconer named Elena trained goshawks using methods verbatim from her great-great-grandmother's journals, her reputation so formidable that ambassadors from Spain begged for demonstrations. But the true testament to their legacy wasn't in the famous names, it was in the quiet adaptations. A shipwright in Lisbon studied falconry manuals to design sails that caught the wind like wings, while a Dutch engineer used medieval vaulting techniques to prevent windmills from shaking apart. Even the family's physical traces lingered in unexpected places. A parish church in Normandy with gargoyles carved exactly like the Falconer's Daughter's favorite Merlin, a Hungarian castle where the spiral staircases mirrored her notes on kestrel flight paths. For nearly 2 centuries, the bloodline held, each generation adding its own innovation until one autumn day in 1624, when the last direct descendant of the architect's son, an elderly nun in a secluded abbey, tucked a crumbling blueprint into a prayer book and passed without an heir. Yet endings are often illusions. Though the family's direct lines faded, their influence only grew stranger and more diffuse. An English naturalist in the 1700s stumbled upon the falconer's training manuals in a mouldering chest and used them to revolutionize ornithology, proving birds navigated by magnetic fields. A French engineer, inspired by the architect's stress distribution sketches, reinvented suspension bridges. Their ideas had escaped the confines of lineage, becoming part of humanity's collective toolkit. Historians might have missed the connection entirely if not for a rainy afternoon in 1897, when a young archivist named Clara Voss pried open a long-forgotten crate in the Strasbourg Cathedral's crypt. Inside lay a trove of parchment construction logs interleaved with falconry notes, sketches of bird bones beside equations for vault loads, even a love letter disguised as a treatise on feather aerodynamics. Clara, who'd trained as both an architect and an amateur falconer, felt the hair on her neck rise. Here was proof that the whispered legends were true. Two medieval visionaries had not only defied their era's boundaries but left a trail of breadcrumbs across 6 centuries, waiting for someone with eyes to see. Today, their story reminds us that legacy isn't about blood or even fame. It's about planting ideas so resilient they outlive their planters. The next time you walk past a building that seems to breathe with its environment, or watch a falconer's bird arc effortlessly against the wind, remember, you're not just witnessing skill. You're seeing a conversation that began on a scaffold 700 years ago between two people who dared to believe stone could fly. The archives of Strasbourg Cathedral held their breath for centuries. Crackled ledgers piled in oak chests, parchment rolls tied with crumbling hemp, sketchbooks so fragile they threatened to dissolve at a touch. Then came the winter of 1889, when a shivering academic named Professor Albrecht pried open a long-sealed compartment behind the choir stalls and found the first clue, a payroll ledger noting payments to the Falconers' Daughter for consultation on spire stability. At first, he dismissed it as a scribe's poetic flourish until his lantern light caught the marginalia. There, in minuscule script, someone had added, "Her birds showed us how the wind lies." What followed was a detective story worthy of the medieval minds it sought to uncover. A librarian in Clermont uncovered a mouldering falconry manual with architectural diagrams crammed between notes on mold patterns. A restorer in Reims found traces of a painted falcon hidden under layers of plaster on a flying buttress, its wings aligned precisely with the structure's stress lines. But the real breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a choirboy practicing scales in the abbey crypt. His high note vibrated a loose stone, revealing a hollow containing a bundle of vellum scraps. There, amid sketches of bird skeletons and half-finished equations, was the architect's son's handwriting. If a peregrine can break mid-dive without fracturing its bones, why can't our spires? Modern technology breathed new life into these fragments. Spectral imaging revealed layers of charcoal underdrawings where the architect's son had practiced curves by tracing feathers pressed into the parchment. Ultraviolet light exposed a shopping list, quills, lime, leather for jesses, scrawled on the back of a vault design. Even the stains told stories. Pollen analysis proved one sketchbook had been used in a falconry muse, its pages dusted with down from long-dead birds. Each discovery was a jigsaw piece, slotting together a picture the medieval church had never intended to preserve. Yet the most poignant find wasn't architectural at all. Tucked inside a psalter, a faded letter in the Falconer's Daughter's looping script addressed to the architect's son. "You asked why I trust the scaffolds. It's not the ropes I believe in, it's the hands that tied them." Historians still debate whether it was ever sent. What's undeniable is how these fragments redefined our understanding of medieval innovation. Before their rediscovery, scholars assumed Gothic engineering was purely mathematical cold calculations of load and thrust. Now we know its brilliance was biomimicry avant la lettre, a dialogue between human ambition and nature's wisdom. Today, their story pulses with unexpected relevance. Engineers studying hummingbird flight apply their principles to drone stability. Architects in earthquake zones model buildings after falcon vertebrae, designing structures that flex rather than fracture. Even the term Falconer's Spire has entered academic lexicon, shorthand for any design that borrows from avian aerodynamics. But perhaps their greatest legacy is the reminder that history's most transformative ideas often hide in plain sight, waiting for a curious mind, a chance vibration, or a shaft of light to reveal them. After all, the past never truly vanishes. It just waits for the right moment to take flight again. 700 years may separate us from the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son, but their story crackles with modern urgency. Look around today's world, where gender barriers in STEM fields persist, where architects scramble to design climate-resilient cities, where innovation too often stalls in the silos of specialization, and suddenly, their medieval collaboration feels less like history and more like a roadmap. Consider Dr. Meade Jemison, the first Black woman in space, who famously blended her training as a physician, engineer, and dancer to revolutionize NASA's approach to human-centered design. Or the Biomimicry Institute's latest project, where ornithologists and civil engineers co-designed earthquake-resistant buildings modeled after woodpecker skulls, a direct echo of how our medieval duo once studied falcon bones to reinforce vaults. Their legacy proves that the most stubborn divides art versus science, tradition versus progress, aren't walls to scale, but invitations to build bridges. Take the gender dynamics at play. In an era when women's contributions were routinely erased from guild records, the Falconer's Daughter didn't just advise, she led. Her name appears in the Strasbourg Masons' Lodge logs not as a footnote, but as a paid consultant, her insights on wind resistance valued equally to any master masons. Fast forward to 2023, when a team of female engineers in Copenhagen redesigned a subway system using principles from migratory bird patterns, only to face skepticism until male colleagues championed the idea. The parallel is uncanny. Progress happens not when we dismiss unlikely experts, but when we recognize that brilliance wears many gloves, whether falconer's leather or lab latex. Sustainability is another thread connecting past and present. Just as the architect's son studied how birds cool their nests to design breathable stonework, today's architects harness termite mound ventilation systems to create zero-energy buildings. The Eden Project in Cornwall, a sprawling biome complex with geodesic domes inspired by soap bubbles and pollen grains, could easily be the spiritual descendant of their feather-light vaults. Both philosophies share a core truth. Nature isn't just something to admire through stained glass, it's the ultimate engineer. When a Barcelona firm recently 3D printed an entire park bench modeled after mycelium networks, they were channeling the same ethos that once led medieval builders to consult hawks about wind currents. But here's the real magic: their story demolishes the myth that innovation requires discarding tradition. The Falconer's Daughter didn't throw out centuries of avian knowledge to please the guilds. She deepened it by asking how feathers could teach humans about balance. Similarly, modern, tradigital artists like Loish blend Renaissance painting techniques with digital tools, proving that old and new can coexist spectacularly. Think of the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, where cracks in pottery aren't hidden but highlighted with gold, a metaphor for how our medieval pair turned perceived weaknesses into strengths. So where does this leave us, holding a challenge as sharp as a falcon's talon? The next time you face a divide between departments at work, between generations in your family, between your own seemingly conflicting passions, ask yourself, What would the Falconer's Daughter see here that others miss? How might the architect's son translate between these worlds? Their greatest lesson wasn't about stone or wings, but about the courage to stand where others see gaps and declare, "Here, we'll build something new." Now it's your turn. Look around. That problem you've been stuck on. What does nature's playbook suggest? That colleague who thinks completely differently from you, where might their perspective reveal hidden solutions? The blueprint is 7 centuries old, but the materials are all around you. All that's missing is your voice in the conversation. Your life might not involve training falcons or designing cathedrals, but somewhere between your passions and your daily routines, your own version of their story is waiting to unfold. Think about it. What's your falconry? That thing that makes you lean forward, that whispers to you like wind through feathers. Maybe it's baking sourdough with the precision of a scientist, or losing yourself in the rhythm of coding late into the night. And what's your architecture? The structure that turns those sparks into something enduring, the spreadsheet that organizes your creative chaos, the garden beds that turn seedlings into sustenance. The magic happens where they meet. Try this. Grab a notebook and sketch 2 columns. On the left, list moments when time disappears, when you're so absorbed you forget to check your phone. On the right, jot down the systems that make those moments possible. Maybe your left column says painting watercolors, and your right reveals the morning ritual coffee, playlist, 10 minutes of free sketching. That intersection, that's your collaboration zone. Now, here's your challenge. Visit the oldest building in your town, a library, a bridge, even a weathered barn. Stand there and imagine the unseen partnerships that built it. The blacksmith who forged the nails, the farmer who fed the workers, the children who carried lunch pails to their fathers. History loves to name individuals, but it's built by teams. Who's on yours? As we close this journey, remember, the Falconer's Daughter and the architect's son didn't just leave behind stone and feathers. They left a blueprint for curiosity, proof that the most ordinary questions, how does a bird fly? Why does this wall stand? Can unravel into extraordinary answers when we dare to ask them together. So keep looking up and keep building. Your spire is waiting. A tapestry woven across centuries, thread by thread, stone by stone, feather by feather. That's the legacy these 2 souls left behind. What began as separate crafts divided by earth and sky became a single story of human ingenuity. The Falconer's Daughter didn't just teach birds to trust human hands, she taught architects to trust the wisdom of wings. The architect's son didn't just carve stone, he carved a new way of seeing, where every curve held the memory of a falcon's dive. Together, they proved that immortality isn't found in solitary genius, but in the spaces between disciplines where one person's impossible becomes another's blueprint. Consider the echoes of their partnership in our own world. Silicon Valley thrives on collisions between coders and designers, just as medieval Strasbourg flourished when falconers and masons shared tools. Modern biomimicry, from bullet trains shaped like kingfisher beaks to solar panels modeled after leaves, isn't a new idea. It's their philosophy reborn. Even the Mars rover's suspension system, designed to navigate alien terrain, owes a debt to the same principles that once stabilized cathedral spires: adaptability over brute force, harmony over dominance. Their greatest lesson wasn't about medieval techniques, it was about mindset. When we stop seeing barriers and start seeing bridges, we don't just solve problems, we transcend them. So what endures? Not just the stones they stacked or the birds they trained, but the radical idea that mastery isn't about guarding knowledge, it's about setting it free. The Falconer's Daughter could have hoarded her avian secrets. The architect's son might have buried his calculations in guild vaults. Instead, they planted their wisdom like acorns, knowing others would grow forests from them. Today, their spirit lives in every open-source collaboration, every interdisciplinary lab, every child who mixes crayons and equations to invent something the world hasn't seen yet. As the sun sets on their story, let it rise on yours. Look up, not just at falcons and spires, but at the unseen collaborations shaping your world, the smartphone in your palm. A symphony of programmers, miners, and glassblowers, the meal on your table, a chorus of farmers, chefs, and truckers. We stand tallest when we recognize the hands that lift us, whether they hold chisels or jesses, keyboards or spatulas. And so we close with an old Breton proverb, whispered by stonemasons and falconers alike. A wing cannot fly without the sky, nor the sky sing without the wing. Build boldly, but never alone. The next chapter of their legacy isn't etched in parchment, it's waiting in the spaces between your passions and the strangers' skills you've yet to discover. The scaffolding is yours to